Today, I'm going to show you how to take your characters from this to this. Hey guys, I'm Eric, and today is my character artist guide to create a scuffed rig in Maya so you can pose your characters.
What?
Yeah. The reason I wanted to make this video is because if you're anything like me, for a long time, I actually just posed my characters by, grabbing verts, like grabbing the verts of the forearm and rotating it and smoothing it, or even doing it in ZBrush. Like I was always kind of intimidated to actually take the time to build a rig, because it felt so time consuming. But I want to show you a technique and some tools in Maya today that you can actually build a rig pretty quickly, and then that's going to give you way more flexibility in how to pose your characters for presentation, especially being able to do multiple poses or try different things. Whereas when you're trying to just like model a character in place, it's kind of rigid and it takes a lot of time to do any additional poses or really try out different things. I want to show you that process. We're going to use what's called the Maya Quick Rig tool. We're going to modify it a little bit. We're going to add some things to it. And we're going to make what I think at the end is a very usable rig for posing and presentation. If you're a rigger or an animator and you're looking for techniques, I'd probably skip this video because this is a scuffed guide by a character artist who does not normally rig. This is merely to be able to pose your characters for presentation. One last note, I did film the bulk of this video last month, but with the holidays and everything, I wasn't able to get it out in time before the end of the year. So this intro is in 2022. This video is in 2021. All right, without further ado, why don't we go ahead and jump in. So for my character, I split him up into some basic groups. I have all the head accessories. I have everything that I'm gonna skin, his eyes and his body. So take a little bit of time to plan what you actually want skinned and what you can actually just parent to a joint. And I'm not gonna go over the basics of everything in terms of rigging. So I'm going into this tutorial assuming you know what skinning is, you know what parenting is, some of these basics, just so that we can actually get through this in a reasonable amount of time. So the first thing we're gonna do is open up the quick rig. You can see if you go to the rigging tab on your UI, or you can go up to skeleton quick rig, and it's gonna bring up this quick rig menu. Now there is a one-click version of it, which you can absolutely try. It's basically just gonna try to automate everything and give you a rig. If your character is really basic, like a single mesh or fairly low poly humanoid, this might work if you just want to get something really quick and be done with it and maybe clean it up a little bit after the fact. But in our case, this character has like a really slumped neck and he's kind of awkward. So we're going to have to do a little bit of manual work, but it's not too bad, I promise. The first thing we need to do is go ahead and just hit the little plus. That's going to create a new profile, and then we can rename that profile. I'm just giving it the orc rig name. The first thing we need to do is add all of our geometry that we want skinned. So just the skinned geometry. So I'm selecting the body and all of the armor that I want skinned, and I'm going to hit the little plus to add it. The second section that you see is guides. Now there's different kinds of methods. I'm going to use imperfect mesh, and I don't really know if there's a reason to use any of the other ones. You could look into this a little bit more, but for characters, I think you just leave this on imperfect mesh and you're good to go. The resolution, for the most part, I do recommend using 512. If your computer's not great like mine, maybe just use 256. It can be a little time consuming. We're just going to use 256 resolution for the purposes of this demonstration. And honestly, for this character, it ended up working fine. All you need to do is hit create and update. Give it a second to think, and you're going to see a whole bunch of little points get placed all around. And these are going to be our guides for placing our joints. So what we need to do now is go ahead and manually translate the position of these little points to all the different areas that they're referencing. So we have, for example, the elbow. We want to go ahead and place that elbow the best we can. And we're going to do this for all the different points. Don't be afraid to hide pieces of geometry if it helps place things, especially like this wrist here. We really want to get it in the right spot. Same with the knees, the feet, the spine, the shoulder. Really try to line those up the best you can. Now this isn't entirely destructive, so you can actually go back and forth between the rig and these guides. So if we go through skinning and it doesn't feel quite right, we can delete the skinning in the rig fix our points and then redo it and see how it looks. You know, don't worry about it too much. We can make adjustments, and always save versions of your scene too, so you can go back in case anything happens. And we're just going to kind of speed through this a little bit because I think you get the idea. You can make all your adjustments on just one side, and then when you're ready, you can actually just click the guides group. You'll see the orc rig guides group in our case, and then hit the little button right here that says mirror, and you can just mirror it all over to the other side. And we're just going to show all our geometry again. Now we can go to the next section. So there's only really one thing you need to worry about in this section, and that is T-stance correction. And this is basically if your character is in an A pose like mine, if you have T-stance correction enabled, it'll create the base pose of your character in a T pose. This is important if you're intending to use any mocap or certain programs that require a T pose. You'll need to have this on. However, if you're just posing your character and you want to make some adjustments to it like we're going to in this video, I find it to be a little frustrating. So I actually turned T-stance off. It's going to kind of give us some errors later down the road, but you can just ignore them. It's fine. We're making a scuffed rig for our character, and we don't need to worry about it too much. So we're going to hit create an update, and we're going to give it a minute. And now you can see we've got a whole rig for our character. So if we go ahead and move any of these controls, you can see that we have full IK on the legs and arms, as well as controls for the hips, the shoulders, all that sort of thing. So it's really cool. And you'll notice like some of the controls, like that wrist control, looks like it's intended for a T pose. That's one of the drawbacks of disabling T-stance correction, but honestly it's fine. You know, you can just work around it to pose your character. And then once that rig is created, you can go to the skinning option and hit create an update. There's a few settings in the create an update menu. Same thing with the resolution up top. I recommend choosing 512 resolution. For some reason, my Maya just gives me an error when I choose 512, so we're going to use 256 for the demonstration. You probably want to use 512. Again, though, like earlier, I used 256, and honestly, the results were totally acceptable for this character, so I'm not worrying about it too much. Now you can see if we move around some of our joints, our character is actually deforming pretty well. Like already, we have a pretty usable rig. Now, we do have the pieces that we need to parent that aren't moving yet, but that's not a big deal. So you can access the HumanIK one of two ways. You can just click the controls on the rig itself, or if you go over to the right hand side, you should have a little HumanIK button. You can also go to skeleton HumanIK, and you'll see that we have a little mannequin that we can actually click the different joints, and those will select the joints for you. So this is kind of cool. You know, just a quick way to be able to see the joints if you don't want to click them in the viewport. And also this menu gives you some other options. It's basically just the home base for the HumanIK system. So now if we ever want to make changes, you can hit the little trash can on the skinning, and that's going to get rid of the skinning. Then same thing for the skeleton. If you want to make changes to the skeleton, you can hit the trash can on that, and then it'll bring back our guides. We can modify our guides and then recreate the skeleton and the skinning. So this is where we divert. Now the problem with the quick rig is it doesn't include finger joints. So if you want to pose your hands, you're kind of out of luck, or you're going to have to go in and model, kind of like hand model the position of those joints after the fact. So we're going to actually modify the quick rig to add hand joints. So if you're not interested in that, you can skip this entire section and skip ahead and don't worry about this at all. But if you're interested, let's continue and take a look at how to make hand joints. So the first thing we need to do is actually place our joints. You can go to skeleton create joint, or the second button on the rigging menu. You can double click that. And the only thing we really need to worry about is turning on projected centering. This isn't even necessary. It's just going to kind of streamline the process a little bit. And what it does is that when you click on a mesh, it tries to project the center of that volume to place the joint correctly. And we're just going to go in and place a few joints, and you can see these joints were way out of position, so sometimes you might need to undo and try again, but also we can modify the position of these joints in a moment. So all you need to do is go into edit pivot mode on the joints. So you can just hit insert on your keyboard, or if you're like me and you bought a 60% keyboard and now realize that not having an insert key is the most frustrating thing in the world in Maya, you can double click the move tool and hit edit pivot and just move that joint into place. So we're just going to adjust the position of our joints. If you're having a hard time clicking your joints and you keep clicking your mesh, add your mesh to a layer and lock that layer so you don't click it. I go back and forth. I brute force it and then I get frustrated and lock the layer. But yeah, always easier to do that. So we're just going to dial these in, and we're just going to go ahead and kind of speed through this. You don't really need to copy exactly what I'm doing. You just need to know that you need to place joints in all of your fingers. So that's what I'm going to go through and do. I'm just going to go through and place the joints down, use the edit pivot to modify their position, make sure you're using edit pivot to move those joints and you're not just moving those joints. So basically what we want to do now is make sure that all our joints are pointing down the fingers so that when you rotate them, they rotate correctly and they're not like all over the place. And in order to do that, we have to do a couple things. So first we're going to parent them like you see here by selecting the top of the finger joint and then shift selecting the wrist and hitting P, and that's going to parent it. You can see by the triangle it's in the right direction. And then we can actually select our wrist joint. And if you right click and do select hierarchy, that's going to select all the joints below that wrist. And then we can go to skeleton orient joint and choose X as our primary axis. And when we hit apply, it's going to do its best to orient the joints. But because our model is in a weird A pose and not a T pose, it's going to struggle a little bit. So we're actually going to have to modify the orientation of these joints a little bit, which is tedious, but worth it, I promise. First, we want to be able to see the orientation of our joints. So again, let's click that wrist and right click, select hierarchy, and we're going to go to display, transform display, local rotation axis. And this is just going to show us the individual axis for each joint. And now we can't just click it and rotate it. We actually need to go into a mode to let us move these around. So what you need to do is up in your UI, you want to click this little button here and then click the question mark. If you right click the question mark, you'll see there's some options in there. All we need is local rotation axis. And now when we click the axis in one of these joints, we can actually move it around. And so all we're looking to do is make sure that X is pointing down the finger the best you can, Z is pointing out, and Y is pointing in the local direction outwards. So instead of Y pointing straight up, we're just kind of having it point roughly outside of each joint. So locally to that joint, what is the Y out direction? I know it's kind of weird, but you'll see what I'm doing here. If we were in a perfect T pose, the Y would just be straight up. But since we're kind of crooked, the Y is pointing outwards, almost like the normal direction. So if you measure in the normal direction, I think the Y axis is very similar. So we're just going to go through all of our joints now and manually rotate that to line up correctly. Now you can see when we rotate our joints, they're all rotating in the direction you would expect a finger to rotate. Now we need to go ahead and mirror our joints over. So what we're going to do is just select all of our finger joints. We're going to hit Shift P to unparent them from the wrist joint temporarily, so they're all their own joint chain again. We're just going to give these a name that we can reference later on. Once we finish naming our joints, we want to mirror them over. So you can select the top joint of each finger and go to skeleton mirror joints. Since we actually made sure to give it a prefix that indicated this was the left hand, you can actually have it replace something in the name with what you want it to. So I'm just going to have it change all the L's to R's so that we know that it's the left hand or the right hand, and then just mirror the joint. Then I'm just going through and clicking the top of each finger and hitting G, which repeats what I just did, and just mirroring all the joints to the other side. And you can see in our hierarchy, we now have all the left hand joints and all the right hand joints. Now I'm going to repeat the parenting process from earlier by clicking the joints and then shift clicking the wrist and hitting P. We're just going to do that on both sides. So now we have a complete hand on both sides of our mesh. Once that's finished, all you need to do is hit the create update skinning, and it's going to create new skinning for our character that includes these new finger joints. Now you can see if we turn our controls back on and our skeleton off, the fingers are moving with the character. And you can even see the skinning on our fingers is actually pretty good for literally doing nothing. Did a pretty good job, so I can't complain. You can always go in after the fact and paint some of these weights, which we're going to do. And that's up to you how far you want to take that in terms of really polishing those skin weights. So we can close that menu for now. And there's one more thing we want to do with our fingers. And you'll notice that we have bones for our fingers, but we don't have controls. It's kind of funny because HumanIK actually has a section here for finger joints. So we're actually going to assign our joints to the HumanIK system so that it creates controls for them that we can use. And you can see in our little mannequin here, there's little arrows next to the hand. If you click one of those arrows, it's going to dive in deeper and show you a layout for the hand. We're just going to go ahead and assign all of our joints. And so in order to do this, we need to first unlock our definitions. So in the HumanIK panel, you see there's definition and controls. Click the definitions tab and then hit the little lock. Now, earlier on, if we had T-pose stance correction enabled and we unlock this, our character would have shot in the T-pose. Since we disabled that, it's going to stay in the position that it is. Now we can actually double click on the thumb and then just choose the joint that you want to assign. And you'll notice when you do that, it's going to mirror over to the other side. You can see the hand actually flip. So when that happens, you need to actually click the little arrow and go back to the left side and do it all over again. If the mirroring is kind of frustrating for you and you don't want to deal with it, you can click the little mirror button right next to the lock and do each side individually. Or you can just keep that on and just make sure that you're going back over to the left hand each time you assign a new joint. So just double click, go through and assign each one of these joints. You can see in my case, I decided to turn mirroring off. So now I'm doing the left hand side. Once you're finished, go ahead and hit the lock again so that we lock our definitions. And then go ahead and click the create controls button that you can see right here. And it's actually going to create IK controls for our fingers. So now you can grab those little IK controls and move your fingers around and kind of get a lot more control. So at this point, we've got a pretty good rig. And if you didn't have anything parented, you're pretty much done. But with our character, we want to go a little farther. And so I'm going to show you how to parent stuff and how to adjust your weights to tweak things a little bit. The next thing we need to do is parent some of our objects to our rig. And so things like the mouth, the eyes, anything that you didn't want any skinning to, all you need to do is grab the mesh or group. So in our case, I have the head accessories group, which is the helmet, the eyes, the mouth. Go ahead and hit edit pivot. You want to set the pivot to the center of the joint that you intend to parent it to. So you can just go ahead and hold V and then V middle mouse drag, and it should snap the pivot to the center. If you need to, hide the meshes so it doesn't snap to the mesh, and just make sure that the pivot is in the center of the joint. Once that's done, what we need to do is first select the joint that we want to parent to. So we're going to select the head joint and then select the head accessories group. Go to constrain, parent, and then you'll see it actually creates a parent constraint under that head group. And now when we rotate our head, everything is moving along with it. Now you can see that some things aren't perfect. And this is actually the skinning on our head, and we're going to fix that in a little bit. But let's go ahead and parent everything that we need to first. And so for the sake of time, we're going to speed run this a little bit. I'm going to speed it up so that we just go through all the objects that we need to parent. I'm just selecting the mesh, edit pivot, snapping that pivot to the joint I'm going to eventually parent the object to. So there we go. We've got the shoulders, we've got the buckle, the belt pieces, the thing on his arm. So anything that we want to parent, we're just going through and repeating the process. You'll see here, I originally had the knee pads skinned, and I decided that I actually just wanted to parent them instead. And so all you need to do is select the mesh, go to edit, delete by type history, and that's going to just delete the skinning on that mesh you have selected. And then I went ahead and repeated the process for parenting it to the knee joint. Now you can see everything is parented to our rig, and when we rotate, everything is moving along. So we're in pretty good shape. We're almost done. So the next thing we want to do is adjust some of the skinning on our character so it just behaves a little bit better. And the most obvious area we need to do that is the head. So we seen earlier when we rotated the head, everything was kind of getting smooshed. So if we select our head mesh, go to skin, paint skin weights, and bring up the options, make sure to hit the little square on the right hand side there. And this menu is a little daunting, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Basically, we get a hierarchy of all the joints that are affecting our head. And then we have a bunch of settings that we can do to change how that joint affects the head. And this is basically an interactive painting tool. It's not too bad. You have opacity and value. We're mainly just going to be playing with that value slider, either making things influence the mesh completely or turning it off. You can also blend a little bit. And so you can see if we click the orc rig head joint, the skinning isn't solid white, so that means there's other joints influencing it, and that's why the head is getting deformed a little bit when we rotate that head joint. So all we need to do is click the head joint, and we're going to turn the value from 0 all the way to 1, and we're going to start painting. You can see now it's actually solid white, and if you hold B and middle mouse drag, you can increase or decrease the size of your brush. But we're just going to go through and actually manually paint the weights on this head to be solid white, so that the head is fully influenced by the head joint. Make sure you really get those ears and you get everywhere in the mouth. You can hit Control 1 on your keyboard to isolate your currently selected mesh and hide everything else. And then you can hit Control 1 again afterwards to bring everything back. As you're painting, you can also hold Shift, so that'll just smooth the transition from white to black a little more gentle. But you can adjust the value and do all kinds of different things. And now you can see if we select the neck is influencing up to a point, and then our head joint takes over. And now when we rotate that head around, it's staying nice and solid and not deforming at all. The other area I really wanted to adjust was this flap in his front here. And I don't want the flap to get deformed when his legs move, which is happening right now. So I'm actually going to paint the weights of the flap to be fully influenced by the hip joint. And that's going to cause some intersection. And so later on, what we'll actually do is add joints to this flap so that we can move it independently of anything else. Basically the same way that we did the fingers. In that case though, we won't add it to the HumanIK, it'll just be its own joint chain. So I actually just hit flood, which takes the mesh and floods it completely with the currently selected value. Another area that I wanted to tweak was the head of this wolf pelt. So I'm just going to paint the head to be fully influenced by the shoulder joint so that when I rotate the arm, it's not getting all deformed and weird and it stays solid. And once you kind of get the hang of it, you'll find that painting weights is actually pretty fun, and it's pretty intuitive to figure out like, okay, I need this joint to affect the mesh a little bit more, I need this joint to affect it a little bit less. And you just kind of play with it and go back and forth until you're kind of keeping your forms and your volumes the way you want them to. And overall, we're in pretty good shape. At this point, you can pretty much call this a finished rig. So you can go ahead and pose your character however you would like and be good to go. And then you could afterwards delete the history and then just go in and tweak things by hand, you know, using the soft select brush and kind of get things how you want it. Now you'll notice our crotch flap there is intersecting, so we would have to actually go in and model that out, like pull it out and play with it, that sort of thing. But for the most part, in a short amount of time, you have a rig that is suddenly much easier to pose your character with instead of trying to sit here and pose it through modeling, which would be very, very tedious and probably not even give you the results that you wanted to begin with. So a couple bonus things I want to show you. Let's actually add some bones to that flap. And the way I'm doing this is first I'm going to place locators. So I just hand placed some locators and duplicated them to choose the points that I actually want to be able to manipulate on my flap. And then I grab that create joint tool, hold V, and just snap the joints to those locators. It just makes it a little easier. And then same deal, we can actually parent that joint to the main rig so that it follows along. Same technique as the bones. I'm using the edit pivot to just tweak the position of these a little bit. And then once we're ready to bind our flap to the joint chain, what we need to do is select the flap, go to edit, delete by type history so that we clear the skin weights on the flap currently. And then go ahead and choose the top of your rig, which is the hip bone. And then go ahead and also select the flap. And we can go to skin, bind, and actually bind the weights to it. For the most part, you can keep those settings stock. You know, if you chose 512 for your resolution, swap to the resolution. And then once it's bound, you see we have much more control over our flap. So now we actually have joints that we can use to adjust this. Now they don't have the same controls as the rest of our rig, but you don't really need those. You can just grab the bones themselves and move it around and just kind of make sure that flap is falling in an area that makes sense for whatever pose you're going for. So you could repeat this process for any additional bones you want to add to your rig. So if you actually wanted to be able to pose the face or have more control over the face, you could add a bone for the jaw and paint weights to that bone, and then you could have a jaw. So there's a lot you could do. It's really up to you how far you want to take this. Obviously with a head, you also could do blend shapes. I'm not intending to do any crazy facial poses for him, so I'll probably just use the soft select to kind of hand model his face into position for a pose. But that's really up to you how far you want to go. You could also use morph targets, that sort of thing. So before we wrap up, I want to give you one more little bonus that you can add to your rigs to make things a little bit easier, and that's actually creating a control for your eyes so that you can control where your character is looking. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to create locator, and we're going to make a locator, which is basically just a control in space. You know, it's like an empty node. And you can line that up with your eyes, and then we're just going to point it out a little bit so it's in the middle distance. So it's kind of like he's looking at that locator. So in this case, what we're actually going to need to do is pull our eyes out of our head accessory group. So we're going to edit their pivots the same way we did earlier. Grab the group, go to edit pivot, and snap the pivot to the head bone. And then we're going to parent them so that they're following the head position. Once that's finished, we want to make sure that our eyes are actually following our locator. And the way we do that is we want to expand our eye groups. And what we're going to do is select our locator and then select the mesh for our eyes and go to constrain, aim, and then do that for all of the meshes that make up your eye. So I have an inner eye and an outer eye. And so I'm going through and hitting the locator, choosing the mesh, and then doing constrain, aim. So that's going to make sure that all of the meshes within our eye groups actually follow the locator. So our groups are driven by the head joint. Our meshes are driven by the aim locator. And so now you can actually see as we move that locator around, the eyes are following it. And that just kind of gives you a little bit more control over where your character is looking and helps you pose him. And then also you can grab that locator and place it under the hip joint so that when you move your rig around, the locator is also moving with it, so it doesn't get lost on you. All right, guys, I hope that was useful to you. I tried to keep it fairly concise. and I tried to show you guys some ways that you can modify the Maya Quick Rig to add additional features. And overall, you know, I think it's really useful and I think it's a great step. And, you know, the bottom line is you should be posing your characters for presentation. Don't just post your stuff up on ArtStation in T-pose. I'm very guilty of this. Everyone's guilty of this at one point. It just adds so much more to your character. And when you pose your character, it brings it to life in a way that you might not have even realized when it was just in T-pose. So, and it helps just bring more personality and more professionalism to your portfolio by having characters posed. And I hope this was able to help you. So go ahead, give it a try. Give me feedback in the comments below and let me know what kind of videos you would like me to make in the future. And I'll see what I can do about it. I've got a few planned, even maybe trying some videos that aren't just tutorials, more maybe general game culture, things like that. We'll see. But I don't want to make any promises. It's been a busy couple months. I love making videos, so I really want to make sure I keep this up. So anyways, yeah, I hope you guys had a great start to the new year and don't stop creating. I'll see you next time. Bye.